Hello, I'm Tom Axworthy, Public Policy Chair at Massey College, and we'd like to welcome you to this discussion in our ethic series on misinformation, disinformation on social media, and whether it is a threat to our democracy. But I want to begin with an acknowledgement that Massey College is on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat peoples and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And Massey has a responsibility and a care to maintain that land well. On the issue then of social media and misinformation, disinformation, Misha Glenny, an author who I admire and has spoken often in Canada, wrote a book some years ago called McMafia, which really began to describe Putin's Russia, has said that we should rename the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that the new four horsemen are Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And he says that because he believes these platforms are polarizing our democracies, leading to huge misinformation, confusing citizens, and are potential tools of foreign powers that wish us ill. So we want to explore these problems and issues and perhaps get on what we can do about it. Governments, organizations, and individuals. So I'm joined by an expert panel with wide experience in this area. And I'd like to begin with Sabreena Delhon, the CEO of the Samara Centre. Samara is one of the leading pro-democracy research institutes in Canada, has done substantial work on many issues, from the role of MPs to party politicians, but also significantly on the impact on social media, with many studies, federal, provincial, and municipal. I read their municipal report, which showed what a problem of abuse were on Twitter accounts. So let's start with an overview from Sabreena.
Thanks, Tom, and it's great to be here. So, at the Samara Centre for Democracy, we're a nonpartisan organization. Our aim is to do research and public engagement work that strengthens Canada's democracy. And in service of this, we've been running a project called SAMBOT since 2021, where we measure the health of political conversations online. And we do this by analyzing abusive content received by candidates in Canadian elections. We focused on the platform X, formerly Twitter, and we have looked at the experience of over 1,000 candidates across a dozen elections, federal, provincial, and municipal. And we do this because it helps us understand mis and disinformation through the lens of working conditions for active citizens. It helps us get a sense of how technology is shaping our democracy. And later this month, we'll release our latest SAMBOT report on the 2023 Alberta election. And by looking at a very specific instance of very high engagement, we're able to pull out some themes that are applicable across the board and big picture. And a key insight from this report is the prevalence of potential inauthentic behavior, including likely fake or artificially generated engagement, particularly through the use of bots. And we also are in a moment where AI generated content is becoming more sophisticated and increasingly difficult to distinguish. So it's harder to know when something is real or not. And that gets at your introduction of how it's a time where citizens are being intentionally confused when they go online. And another aspect to this is the rise of hateful content and the accelerated and amplified way that it's spread on social media platforms. So, through our work, we've seen that content that has to do with LGBTQ plus rights gets very high engagement. It's particularly abusive, and it's a worrying finding that we've observed across several elections. So all of this ends up taking a very serious toll on not just representation, but also participation in our politics. When we looked at the last federal election in 2021, we found that female candidates endured far more personal and misogynistic abuse than their male counterparts. And we also know that there is a chilling effect, not just on who's going to step forward, who's going to stay in the political arena, but on the public at large, on the electorate at large. There's a chilling effect on our engagement. And as we know from recent reports, this has a direct link to foreign interference, particularly targeting diaspora communities in Canada, which make up a significant percentage of our population. So this is, some broad strokes that pulls from our research and helps us understand how abusive content relates to mis and disinformation online and starts to shape our reality in terms of how we perceive and regard our democracy in harmful ways.
Just one quick follow-up question from your opening statement. Um, I've read studies that in the United States, about 80% of citizens get most of their information about elections or other things on social media. Is that comparable in Canada? In the US, print was under 10%, and 80% was social media. Are we in that same boat?
Well, we've seen a decline in support for journalism in Canada. We've seen a decimation of local news outlets in our country. And with that comes, news deserts, gaps where reliable information is not available. It's hard to find. And if we pair that with the absence of civic and digital literacy, we have a pretty terrible situation in terms of where people feel they can go to for reliable information. And there's also distrust in our democratic institutions. And a lot of people in our country feeling as if legacy media outlets and other places that we've turned to for reliable information, they should think twice before turning there. It's not that they don't want to trust these institutions, but the prevalence of the way the conversations have evolved online have brought forth lack of certainty and discomfort and made people feel like they shouldn't trust. And so when you're casting around and looking for a place to go to for information, you'll be drawn to certain personalities or platforms because their algorithms are catering to you in a specific way. They're giving you what they think you want to see, and you continue to engage on that so you get more. Or you have people disengaging altogether because they're fearful of participating in these conversations online and they're not sure where they're supposed to turn.
Good, thank you. Sabreena mentioned foreign use of social media platforms, and therefore I'd like to turn to Marcus Kolga, one of the foremost experts in cybersecurity in Canada, a fellow of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's appeared before Parliament talking about cyber threats, and a good friend of Massey College, having appeared at several of our public policy events. So delighted to see you again. And is Sabreena right that the use by foreign powers of these powerful new tools is a tremendous threat to how we run a stable democracy?
Well, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Tom, for that introduction. Yeah, absolutely. I've been monitoring and analyzing Russian information operations for over 15 years, since around 2007, when they first started in attacking Estonia during the Bronze Soldier riots. And I can definitely say that the threat of disinformation, their exploitation of social media platforms to deliver these, or engage in information warfare, certainly poses a threat to our democracy and society. And this has only grown and intensified over time. So I'm going to use my opening remarks to share some of my thoughts and insights about the latest tactics, techniques, and procedures deployed by the Kremlin as part of their information and influence operations targeting Canada. Now, for the Kremlin, the primary overall objective of its information influence operations is to ensure regime survival, consolidate its power, and enrich its leaders. And whether we're examining Moscow's foreign information campaigns, its internal repression, or its aggression abroad, we have to view it through this lens. So right now, the Kremlin's top priorities include justifying Russia's war against Ukraine, dehumanizing Ukrainians to undermine Western support for Ukraine, and ultimately enabling Russia's colonization of eastern Ukraine and beyond. Another key objective is the breakdown of unity within NATO and Russia's efforts to intimidate and dominate our European allies while demoralizing and eroding public trust in our own armed forces. And finally, they're seeking to erode trust and confidence in our democratic institutions and erode our social cohesion so that we're less resilient to Russia's attacks and to make Putin's dictatorship appear more preferable among Russians to what he portrays as the chaos, decadence, and social perversions of Western liberal democracy. Now, in terms of achieving this, what the Kremlin has truly mastered over the past decade is to identify potentially polarizing issues, political biases, and then igniting them and pushing them to the extremes. And this has become, of course, simpler as our biases have intensified over the years. Now, having a bias or viewpoint is perfectly natural, of course, and media has always catered to them to a certain degree. For example, 30 years ago, politically center-left families in my neighborhood, for example, had the Toronto Star delivered to their homes, whereas the center-right families had the Toronto Sun delivered. But thanks to the internet, we've witnessed a rapid rise in ideological extremists, profit-driven grifters, and influencers on both the far left and far right who amplify and intensify those extremes for financial gain or political influence. And now this polarizing trend is definitely impacting Canadians as well. A recent Angus Reid poll found that more than 1/3 of Canadians identify as, quote, political orphans, and nearly half feel that major political parties have shifted too far to the left or too far to the right, and these divisions have created fertile ground for Russian information operations. And now we have formal evidence of the Kremlin's strategies and tactics to exploit them and disrupt our democracy. An FBI affidavit published last September centers on a Russian operation called Doppelganger, in which Russian agents created websites to mimic Western media outlets, which then lured Western audiences in order to expose them to various disinformation narratives. The affidavit included official minutes from within the Russian presidential administration instructing agents to monitor Western information spaces and create false information to inflame existing divisions or to even invent new conflicts. Those official documents also highlight the importance of a global network of influencers whose anti-Western, anti-NATO, or anti-democratic views are exploited to amplify Kremlin-aligned narratives. Now, around this same time, a U.S. Department of Justice indictment exposed how two RT employees, that's Russia Today, allegedly orchestrated a $10 million scheme to inject Kremlin-aligned narratives into Canadian and American information spaces. Now, under their guidance, two Canadian influencers formed a company called Tenant Media, through which they allegedly paid other influencers up to $100,000 for a single podcast episode designed to sway North American opinion. Now, it's important to note that RT has been flagged by Global Affairs Canada, the US State Department, and the UK Foreign Office as a key element of Russia's intelligence apparatus. Research by the Canadian Digital Media Research Network shows that actually 50% of the content produced by Tenant Media carried negative sentiments about Canada. And moreover, their content often focused on broader ideological issues, meaning Canadians consuming it might not even have realized that they were being influenced by the Russian government. We know that Canadians are vulnerable to Russian disinformation. In a joint poll by DisinfoWatch, my organization, and McGill University last spring, we found that 71% of Canadians reported encountering at least one Kremlin-aligned anti-Ukrainian narrative, and that many were unable to identify those narratives as Russian disinformation. For example, 48% believed or were unsure if the statement that, quote, NATO and Ukraine started the war with Russia is false. And the influencers who amplify Russian narratives aren't confined to one side of the political spectrum either. They operate on both the far right and the far left. Now, a study I co-authored with Brian McGuinn at the University of Regina last year revealed that over 200,000 Canadian Twitter accounts were exposed to Russian disinformation from both extreme ends of the political horseshoe. And notably, about 80% of those accounts exposed to them belonged to everyday Canadians who weren't politically aligned at all. Now, some will still argue that Russia doesn't prioritize Canada, but the weight of evidence tells a different story. From historical influence operations to sophisticated online manipulation, Moscow has persistently sought to interfere in our democracy. And we know it's happening. The evidence is clear. And I believe we now have to move on from admiring this problem to developing strategies and tactics to disrupt, prevent, and deter them. As we move through this upcoming liberal leadership campaign and on to a federal election, we can be absolutely sure that our foreign adversaries, including Russia, will try to disrupt those democratic processes. And so we have to expose and actively challenge these narratives while holding the Kremlin's Canadian collaborators to account. And this includes leveraging existing legislation to prosecute those who violate our sanctions laws, and in the near future, fully implementing and enforcing Bill C-70. And so I will leave it there for now.
Just a follow-up question as well, Marcus, then, in terms of the title of this ethics session. As I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, misinformation is when people make mistakes, exaggerations. Often politicians are exaggerating achievements or problems or so on. And so those are errors, but they're not necessarily designed to be so. And some worry now that Facebook and others are used to have fact checkers are taking these people off, which we perhaps can discuss. But as you've described it, disinformation is the intent is clear right from the start to bring fraudulent and serious allegations to confuse and disrupt people. So there is a distinction between misinformation and disinformation, correct?
You're absolutely right. Misinformation is innocent. There's no intent to necessarily mislead, whereas disinformation is false information that is created with the intent to mislead. So going back to those FBI affidavit documents that I mentioned during my opening remarks, I mean, it's very clear. The Russian presidential administration has instructed its agents and including contractors inside Russia to engage in this sort of activity, to create false information, disinformation, to create conflicts in the Western world, including right here in Canada. So it's a question of intent, and disinformation is intended to mislead us.
Good, thank you. I'd like to turn to our third panelist, Sophie Sacilotto from the Monk School. And she is a young scholar who is already making a reputation for her research in this area. She's worked both in Latvia and Lithuania, has firsthand experience on what is occurring in those Eastern European countries. Marcus has referred to Russia, but intense campaigns obviously across Eastern Europe. And I would just like to begin, Sophie, on what is there about social media that makes them such an important influence? Why are the 80% following social media? And is there something about social media that makes them particularly good for the kinds of disinformation or exaggeration that Marcus has described? What is this beast, social media?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, Tom. I think social media platforms are, by their nature, accessible to anyone on the internet. And so it's virtually impossible to determine where information comes from when it is posted, and what people's sources are, and if the person who posts it is in fact a person. It's very difficult to determine that. And the platforms host large quantities of information that, as they're uploaded by anyone on anything and on a consistent basis, it makes fact checking the information next to impossible, because the constant upload of information is it cannot be kept up with by human processors. So in summary, you end up with a platform of information that is available to anyone, anywhere, at any time, full of a mix of information and opinions without a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are consuming that information as you would consume information from, say, the CBC, and you're consuming it as fact, then you don't know what exactly you are consuming as fact. You could be consuming someone's opinion, you could be consuming a conspiracy theory someone's trying to promote, or in the case of Russia, you could be consuming a narrative that has been created and then inserted into social media in order to influence you. And so we end up with COVID-19 is a great example of all the variety of different narratives that came up in that time and were spread, including different ways to prevent the virus and different ways to protect yourself that were not sourced or deemed reliable by government and medical institutions. And it also, with the additional insertion of AI and generative AI, you have images that are doctored and that might appear to be true, but you just don't know. And things are very convincing in this area of AI. So you really don't know what it's a lot harder to determine than it used to be if the content you're consuming is real, and it's a lot harder to know where to look for good information to challenge what you're researching.
So as difficult and as bad as the situation is now, and we've talked about that a little bit already, you're saying with AI it's going to get worse.
Oh yes, most definitely. And because as well as computers get better, it gets more and more difficult for the naked eye and also for computers themselves to tell us if audio generated content or altered images are AI generated or manipulated or not. One example of a recent narrative would be President Zelensky of Ukraine. There was a doctored image of one of his addresses that he made to the public sitting at his desk. The image was doctored to show what was then alleged to be a pile of cocaine on the corner of his desk, which had been inserted there by someone who had altered the image to make it appear like the president had a pile of cocaine on his desk, which he did not have.
And also just prior to the show, I looked at debunk.org, which I know you've done some research with and have an association with. One of their recent reports showed that ads were also a major tool of disinformation, misinformation, that it's not just fake news stories, but people are bringing out ads which are fraudulent, perhaps for monetary reasons, or perhaps for disinformation reasons. So that's another tool that those who are doing us ill on democracy are using, is fake advertising in addition to fake news and stories.
Exactly. And through fake advertising as well, it's not only a method to spread content, but also to make money. Okay. And you can then make money as a malactor or like someone spreading disinformation that you can then use to continue your process. And you can use to continue to spread this information. It's organizations as well, such as Meta and X, are, despite the best efforts of organizations like Debunk, they are not responsive in following their own guidelines of what are ads that are disinforming people and what are ads that violate their own rules of the content that they post online.
And that is because the ad revenue or the bottom line is more important to them than the ethics that they say they are following in terms of fairness on their sites.
Their motives in the work that they do are very different from the motives of organizations such as debunk.org, where I currently work, or Disinfowatch, which is run by Marcus Kolga.
Okay. So a question then that any of you can pick on both Sabreena and Marcus mentioned it, and it's the question of trust, that trust in our institutions, trust in our parties, trust in our fellow citizens. We've had many long philosophical treatises that trust is essential to the functioning of of a civic and civil society, and yet we see trust declining and eroding in institution after institutions. Um, and that's not just because of social media. It's really been happening since the 70s for a variety of reasons, distrust in parties and so on. But I took it from your conversations or the points you made that it is dramatically accelerating in the era of social media, and that the nature of the platform accelerates your lack of trust in institutions because you can't believe what you're reading. Is that correct? Sabreena, would you like to
Yeah, sure.
talk trust issue? And then Marcus.
Yeah, sure. So I think a key part of this is the fact that it can be a small number of users that shapes a conversation online. There can be a disproportionate amount of influence if you're looking to spread disinformation on a particular platform. And then the result there is a skewing of online conversations, particularly political ones, and making them more hostile, more abusive, and less representative of the views of actual Canadians. So, when we looked at the last mayoral by-election in Toronto in 2023, we found that just 30 Twitter users accounted for 10% of all of the abusive tweets. And similarly, in the 2023 Alberta election, it was just 50 Twitter users that accounted for 12% of all of the abusive tweets. So, the speed at which, mis and disinformation and abuse can travel is significant, but these platforms are also invested in accelerating this material because it results in high engagement, which then leads to high profits. And we need to remember these platforms don't exist to provide a public service. It's not a public space. These are companies and they're looking to make a profit. And if it results in unsafe spaces for civic dialogue, so be it. That's they're being increasingly transparent about that. So this will degrade trust in our democratic institutions. But trust also comes from responsiveness. So if trust has been declining since the 70s, as you've noted, Tom, what are these institutions doing in response? And as Marcus has noted, we can't admire the problem, right? So what have we been doing about it? And there is a sense of complacence in Canada about this issue. We have been slow to act on this. We are lagging behind countries in Europe, and recent reports about foreign interference have also confirmed that Canada has a lot of catching up to do in this regard. And trust isn't just about looking for accountability from these platforms, it's also about building a healthy and functioning relationship with the electorate.
So you make a very interesting point that a small number of users can have a disproportionate influence on the sample as a whole because their evocative and abusive tweets are then retweeted and reshared, and it spreads in
Yeah.
that way. And they work at this constantly so you could have 50 bad folks, but they're influencing hundreds of thousands of people potentially.
Yeah, and if you're only using one platform to understand, what's going on in an election, then that's going to become the dominant view of the entire conversation. And it's the worst stuff that's going to get accelerated and amplified the fastest and most broadly on a platform because it gets the most engagement. That's part of why we've seen in our research content about LGBTQ plus rights be so prominent. It's hateful content, it gets a lot of engagement, and it gets circulated very quickly. And if you're not active on other platforms or if you're not going to other spaces for reliable information, it begins to be set as the view of what's actually happening, what's actually normal. And our social norms start to change because what's happening online has real world consequences.
Mm-hmm. So, Marcus, you mentioned that when you were growing up in your neighborhood, some houses would take the Toronto Sun and others the Toronto Star. So there was a difference there, but both both papers then, there were accountability. They did have editors and they did have ethics, and people slip on ethics, but they're well known, press councils and so on. But the world that you've been describing and the panel's been describing is kind of the Wild West. There's no one accountable. I mean, is that part of the issue? Who, if there are 50 folks can be abusive on tweets that affect, they're accountable to no one about themselves, particularly if they're deliberately doing it, which is the situation that you described in terms of Russia.
Well, yeah, Tom. I mean, I would say that there's no motivation for any of these platforms to be accountable. There's no motivation for them to clean up their act because, quite frankly, what they're doing is exploiting our biases and those biases that are growing. So again, exploitation of bias is actually quite profitable for platforms like X and Facebook, and we can see from the owner of Twitter X that he is further trying to exacerbate the divisions and polarization that he, number one, makes quite a bit of money off of, but also has been able to gain considerable political influence through that platform. And I just to say, furthermore, to all of these biases and the growing polarization is that some of the extremism that we're seeing, the abusive content that we're seeing, truly is becoming normalized. We're seeing this in our mainstream political discussions. We're seeing this in the House of Commons. This is truly a major problem in terms of our long-term social cohesion. We can't keep going on like this, and so I hope that we can soon come together under the leadership of whether it's this government or a future government to create some sort of a whole of society solution, because that's what it's ultimately going to take to rebuild that trust and maintain the social cohesion that right now I see as being aggressively torn apart.
You mentioned specifically the coming Liberal leadership effort that will produce a new prime minister, and then shortly, whether it's weeks or months after the election. Given what you know, what Russia can do, can you paint for us what may happen in that context if you were out to disrupt it and mess up the process and so on, or even get a result that you want? What kind of things might we expect, or that the Liberal Party should be expecting, might or potentially could happen in that contest from the bad guys?
Yeah, good question, Tom. Look, we had a preview of how they might disrupt this campaign and the upcoming election back in 2018, specifically with Ms. Freeland, when Chrystia Freeland was Minister of Foreign Affairs. In 2018, she was championing legislation called the Magnitsky legislation. This is a law that allows our government to place asset freezes and visa bans on corrupt Russian officials who engage in human rights abuses. The Kremlin, Vladimir Putin himself and the kleptocrats that support him had no interest in seeing this legislation passed. And so Ms. Freeland was targeted by a transnational disinformation campaign, or transnational repression, I should say. This campaign manipulated Ukrainian history, her personal history, to suggest that Ms. Freeland is a neo-Nazi sympathizer, a whitewasher of Nazi crimes. And this is the same sort of narrative that we've seen even going back to the Cold War, but more recently during Russia's recent full-scale invasion of Ukraine, whereby the Kremlin has suggested that Ukraine's Jewish President Zelensky, is a neo-Nazi and that all Ukrainians are neo-Nazis. So Ms. Freeland was targeted with that same smear, that same label, in efforts to discredit her and her work. It didn't work, but we can expect the same. Vladimir Putin is not interested in seeing Ms. Freeland become the next leader of the Liberal Party, nor prime minister. She's respected. She has demonstrated that she is tough on authoritarians. And so I think we should expect to see more of that. And I should mention that just over the past 2 weeks, we've actually seen negative political messaging and ads that are popping up in Facebook and Twitter, specifically targeting Canadian elected officials. Jagmeet Singh using AI to make it appear as if he's got a black eye, and that he has been handcuffed. There have been other ads that portray Pierre Poilievre as having been arrested, and Ms. Freeland as well. The fact that these ads are making it through the algorithms on those platforms that are supposed to prevent that sort of negative political advertising and disinformation from being spread are clearly on there. And the interesting thing is that those links that are appearing on Facebook and on Twitter are leading to fake news sites. Sites that, for all intents and purposes, appear to be like the Toronto Star, like the CBC, like the Globe and Mail, that contain false news on them. So the fact that social media isn't moderating itself to pull these ads off means that we could be seeing more politically motivated advertising on those sites. That includes disinformation. So I think we're in for a real wild ride over the coming months.
Sophie, we know from a recent Statistics Canada survey that the things that we're talking about in this panel, I think it was something like over 60% of Canadians who were surveyed were very worried about their information sources on the internet, and over 45% of those folks said that they were worried about it, but they didn't really have time to deal with it themselves. So I'd like to begin swinging into the kinds of responses. What can we do? What can we learn from what others have done? And give me a flavor of, are we helpless in this, or are there things we can do to begin to right the terrible situation that's been described by all of you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're not at all helpless in this, and we know we've started. This isn't a new thing. We've started countering, and we've been building an arsenal of ways to counter it, and also knowing what works and what doesn't. Mm-hmm. For example, fact checking. While it might seem effective, it is not that effective in the long run, because in the case of fact checking, you are asking someone to engage in what is already quite an intensive social media and media environment, and then spend likely an equal amount of time on fact-checking sites to confirm the information that they've received. So that isn't very effective. The main thing for people to be focusing on that is really beneficial across their lives is media literacy and engaging in media literacy programs. Debunk, for example, is currently, we host a variety of different courses online that are totally free to understand what is disinformation, and down to the level of, okay, what are stereotypes? What are religious stereotypes? What are different examples of these stereotypes or biases when they come up online? So you know when you see it, what you're looking at, and as well how to question it and where to follow up for different sources. Or if you are comfortable going, I'm not sure about that, but I'm just not going to believe that, and I'll kind of leave that for later. And so really media literacy is the best way to do it, but as well in terms of a government level, deplatforming, removing copycat websites, as Marcus was talking about, those websites that look like they are real and look like they are, say, the CBC, but are actually run by Russia and have disinformation sources on them, removing those websites, removing and like deplatforming different social media platforms and social media accounts that are being manipulative, spreading disinformation, and spreading hate.
So for you or for the rest of the panel, who removes them? Are we talking about the role of government? So what's the implementation mechanism for getting rid of this stuff if Facebook and Instagram and others won't do it? What's the framework, and how do we make it happen? Who'd like to jump in? I'll call on you first, Ben Marcus, if there's no jumpers here.
Okay, well, cool. Very quickly. I mean, it's we've been hoping over the past few years that social media would regulate itself. And it was moving in that direction, I'd have to say. Twitter, at least before Mr. Musk took it over, did have a robust program in place. They were responsive when fact checkers would message them about disinformation they'd seen, and they would themselves take those posts down. Things have only become exponentially worse since COVID. And now we're seeing, Facebook basically saying that they're going to end all moderation. So I don't think there's any hope in social media doing this on their own. I think we should look to Europe, to the Digital Services Act in Europe. They have this legislation that requires social media to take down any posts when they are identified within a time frame. And Sophie, you may correct me, I think it's about 24 hours, 48 hours or something like that after the notification is sent. If these social media platforms do not take down those posts, then they face very stiff fines. And I mean hundreds of thousands of euros. And the longer those posts stay up, the number just keeps going up. And so this seems to be working to a certain degree in Europe. I think with the situation in the United States, at least for the next 4 years, there's no hope of the US government adopting such regulations or trying to get the social media companies to moderate themselves. So maybe this is something that Canada should be looking at, maybe harmonizing and adopting legislation that is similar to the European one, and working with the Europeans to try and help clean up our information space.
Okay.
Yeah, if I can jump in, Tom. So, just to build on what Sophie and Marcus have said, most Canadians are not aware that these information threats are everywhere, and how pervasive and how constant they are, and that they're showing up in all of our feeds, that we are personally affected by this if we're online. And so certainly there's an opportunity to enhance digital literacy across the board here. This should be a national strategy. This should be taught in school, and this should be available to adults as well, because it's wild to think about the fact that we just all flocked to these platforms, gave it our data, our content, and then now it's all out of control. So let's get some control back, and we can do that. And it's also important to note the experience of diaspora communities in Canada too, to make sure that these resources are responsive to their lived experience and the high level of threat and harm that they are exposed to here in Canada, and that their families back home are as well. And it's not just the big four that we're talking about here. There are some pro-social platforms available, and a lot of innovation happening in this space that we can take some hope and positivity from. And certainly there's an audience for it. So look at how many people have flocked to Blue Sky in the last couple of months in response to Elon Musk's decisions and erratic behavior. That's not necessarily a profit-driven exclusively platform. There's also lots of work happening around publicly funded social media platforms that can exist for the express purpose of being pro-democracy and in the public interest.
Are there examples of that?
Yeah, so there's some sites like Polis, and there's another one called, I think, Free Our Websites or something like that. There's like a whole movement under the pro-social design world that we can take some optimism from. But Blue Sky, I think, is the biggest one. And Marcus and Sophie, please, let me know if there are other ones that we should be looking to. None of these are perfect, and we really have to modify our expectations, right? Like, we can't just expect to flock to one platform and everything will be okay. This is all within an ecosystem where we also need to support journalism and talk to our neighbors if we want to have a healthy democracy and have a handle on what's real in terms of information and what's really going on in our country.
Marcus.
Yeah, and that all comes back to literacy. Media literacy and critical thinking. I think we can look to other jurisdictions who have done this well. Finland is a perfect example of a country that has been doing this well for nearly a decade. In their case, digital media literacy is built into every course that is taught in Finnish curriculum from kindergarten up until graduation, grade 12 or 13, whenever they graduate there. But it's baked into every course. So you'll have a mathematics course on statistics, which will teach students how statistics can be manipulated by outside actors. History, it's taught in those courses. In civics, every single course has it baked into it. It's not just an hour a semester or one course or one class a year, which might be forgotten by students. It's in there full time, and this is something that we need to emulate and build into our system to rebuild in long term that trust and resilience in our democracy. And again, building up that understanding for younger generations so that they have the critical thinking skills to filter out much of what we're talking about today, and again, return trust to mainstream media and journalists.
Sophie, do you have some comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, this, I feel like Marta's comment feeds really well into the a speech given by Ursula von der Leyen, where she spoke about Baltic countries and said, like, these are the countries that have known about Russia, known about Russian disinformation for decades, and have been flagging it since the fall of the Soviet Union. And that this is why it's important to listen. And this was in the context of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But yet they have these curriculums and this knowledge and understanding. Even I love reading Latvian and Lithuanian news, national news. I find it fabulous because they label all their articles as politics, economics, culture, whatever it is. It's a short article, and then at the end they have a little box that says, "Did we get anything wrong? Please tell us if we mistranslated or if a fact here is incorrect." And I feel like even those elements visually inspire more trust, because you have a visual indicator that there is this accountability. Because the difference at the end of the day between a good news organization and a disinformation one is a good news organization prints retractions and says we were wrong. Mm-hmm. And if you're spreading disinformation, you don't do that.
What about Canada? We've had some interesting examples in Europe. We've just been mentioning Latvia and Lithuania as well. We've talked to that social media as a regulator itself has not much happened, and certainly isn't. The trend lines there are bad. Where are we on our country, our government authorities? You three are obviously seized with this issue. We talked about baking in digital literacy right into the curriculum from K onwards up. Is anybody doing this? Where does Canada stand on its understanding of the severity of the problem that we've all been articulating for the last hour? What's the Canadian? Do we get a C, a D minus? Sabreena, start. Give us
Why don't we have it be pass fail? And we're failing right now, but we can improve. So I think a lot of this is also connected to a sense of national pride. Is this about not just defending ourselves in the face of something threatening and scary and it seems insurmountable, but can we reverse this? So this is about strengthening and protecting our democracy, taking pride in Canada, and making it a matter of national importance to be equipped to participate in our democracy in the 21st century. So I think that's kind of what can underpin the literacy skills that we're looking to have, that we've discussed here from childhood, but also to adulthood. And if we look at recent reports through, let's say, like the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians and the Hague Commission, they've both shown that Canada is woefully behind in terms of really dealing with foreign interference. We've been quite naive about this as well. And maybe there's been a sense of, well, we'll see what the US does and then we'll kind of follow suit from there. But this is, again, back to pride. We have to take care of our own democracy. There's a real opportunity for us to be a model on the world stage and protect what we have and make it more resilient. And if we want to counter foreign threats, a big part of that is, updating privacy and social media regulation to meet the current moment. And we're at such a strange time because we saw some important potential steps forward through the Online Harms Act, and now it's unclear with Parliament prorogued and an election on the horizon what will happen next. It will be up to the next government to pick that up again. But certainly, I think a consolidated and organized effort with civil society organizations to come together on what we want from our democracy instead of kind of always being on the back foot. There's an opportunity here for us to really build out an agenda, a plan, a vision for what 21st century democracy in Canada can look like.
Mm-hmm. Marcus, your views, and then Sophie as well.
I would also say that we're failing. We've failed to recognize a lot of the threats that we're seeing today, even with the Hogue inquiry. The failure to recognize Russia as a threat. There's so much focus on China, but Russia was largely ignored. This is a big problem. But having said that, I think we're making some progress here. The rapid response mechanism that's housed at Global Affairs, that is charged with monitoring the information space for foreign influence operations, for disinformation, is doing an excellent job. It is highly respected amongst our allies, and it's grown bolder in its own sort of social media feed, the way that it is trying to draw attention and raise awareness of specifically Russian disinformation narratives is positive. We've adopted new legislation, C70, that will hold the collaborators, those who act as influencers, appearing Canadians who appear on RT and legitimize those Russian narratives. They will be forced to now register as agents of influence with our government. And as far as transnational repression is concerned, which is another growing threat, we have new laws that will allow CSIS, our law enforcement, to help communicate with vulnerable communities. A lot of those communities are ethnic minority communities that are targeted by transnational repression. So the new legislation that's being passed will help support them and hopefully disrupt, deter, and prevent these sorts of operations in the future. But so much more needs to be done. And certainly greater collaboration with civil society and a whole society approach is required to build that long-term resilience against these operations.
Sophie, how do we do that?
I would say, we already have a very strong body of very smart people who are very good at work at countering disinformation, researching it, and really addressing this problem. I worked with many of them in Latvia through the Enhanced Forward Presence there, and there's many here who are very strong in this ability, working at it in Europe. But I think the biggest thing we need to take away, and we need to remember addressing this problem, is this problem is a problem that is addressed in so many other places around the world. We don't need to come up with our own solutions. We can be going to the European Union, going to Estonia, going to Ukraine, talking to these countries and saying, what are you doing and what should we adopt from you? Because we don't need to invent new solutions. That's going to take too long, and they might not work. They probably won't, because they'll have to be workshopped and evolved over time. So taking existing solutions that have been implemented in other regions and implementing them in Canada, I think is the best solution and is the best way to do this in a time-efficient manner.
Now, another layer of this, we've been talking about governments and so on. In the time we have left, Sabreena, you were talking about the abuse sent to around particular issues or particular individuals around an issue. And Marcus, you talked about one individual, Madam Freeland, being personally attacked. And we know that women in particular, women in authority, running for office or in office, I've had many friends who've been on municipal councils and so on. And it's hard enough to be a politician, let alone what they are going through, or leaders of advocacy groups getting besmirched online. So I'm throwing out this question: what should individuals do? I mean, do you stand up and say it's a lie and fight it on social media itself? Do you call a press conference? Do you try to report it to the police? I'm just individuals or organizations subjected to these disinformation or these abusive attacks. What do we do? What do they do?
Well, I can jump in on that. So, when we talk to former members of parliament about their experiences in office, so this is another study we do, the MP Exit Interview Project. A lot of the women we speak to say that they didn't block or report or make a fuss because they didn't want to look like they were trouble. And when you're underrepresented in your democracy in the first instance, you just have a bigger burden to bear. And so, the flip side of this is the public view of politicians and the sense of like, well, you're asking for it, you're in the public eye, what do you expect? But we find that when we frame this abuse as conditions of work, people are not safe being active citizens in Canada. It's highly likely that they will encounter abuse online, whether they're politicians, whether they're seeking office, whether they are other types of leaders that are just active citizens. It's going to happen, particularly if you're a woman and otherwise from an underrepresented community in our democracy. So if we frame it as conditions of work, then it helps because who's the employer? Everyone we agree that should be safe at work in Canada. So how can that framing help us to put some protections in place? There's not really any training and formal onboarding of a candidate to a social platform, really. And what are our expectations of political parties to protect their candidates online? Can you block a constituent? We need to figure this all out. And people who are functioning at the local level have it the worst. There's no party to buffer anything. And a lot of what they get will be more personal because it's from their own community that they're living in. So if this doesn't get addressed sufficiently, we're not going to be attracting the problem solvers that we need for this very complex moment for our country. Instead, we'll be attracting people who are also just fine with being on social media and behaving in uncivil and unsustainable ways. So it is a serious problem that needs to be addressed, not just in the political arena, but in terms of supporting the contributions of the tremendous active citizens that already are doing an important work and ensuring that their conditions of work are safe and sustainable.
I mean, we've talked about one response for citizens is media literacy and working at that. Another thing we have to be better educated about. But are there groups or associations, the groups that you're associated with, if you're attacked on social media as a community leader or an individual that can go to for a playbook or a mutual support group? I mean, because these are terrible individual decisions to say, should I respond because it'll get more attention, or do I just have to grin and bear it? And yet then it continues with no consequences. Marcus, what advice would you give?
Well, sadly, there are no such organizations right now that exist. I've unfortunately been the focus of Russian transnational repression already for nearly a decade. Whether it's false reports that have appeared on Russian state media, whether it's attacks from their influencers here in Canada, it's problematic, and there's very little support that you can receive. It's psychologically, it's a grind. It wears you down. And I think that's one reason why you have, at least when it comes to this sort of domestically aggressive abuse that we're seeing, why you see bright MPs like Pam Damoff, who's decided not to run again because she just can no longer take the abuse. So there isn't anyone that the victims of this sort of abuse of transnational repression can turn to right now. And I think this is something that we need to start talking about. I know those discussions are starting to happen amongst civil society organizations in academia. But at the moment, there really are no tools for the victims. And this is something that we need to really start looking at.
Sophie, last word.
Yes,
Last word to you.
I would say like the number one, if that like in realms of people to turn to, the number one people to turn to are the people who have already or are also going through it. And I think in terms of my having entered this space in the last 5 years, the things that I have been equipped with from the get-go have been, you do not put anything on social media. You delay every post by 3 to 6 months, so no one knows where you are when you're there. You do not associate yourself with the organizations you're working for publicly, especially when you were initially hired. You always delay that. And just as well, when you're traveling and when you're different places, don't tell people who you work for. Don't say what you do. And especially when dealing with Russia, I have like, you don't work in places that are publicly identifiable. You don't tell people where your work is, just to keep it and to having that extreme level of privacy, but having that as as somewhat of a barrier. And even in that case, you still have people who can somehow find your phone number or other ways, but like you share that with your team and you just keep everything under wraps.
So you have a personal defense mechanism to have as much privacy as you can gather in this interconnected world, and you don't use social media for social media purposes the way it was intended.
Exactly. And that's something that's that's something I learned from the people, from like established people in the industry around me, and that was what was recommended, because that way you keep an eye on, you know what you put out, you use certain websites to see if your passwords have been leaked, your emails have been leaked, whatever else, and just to keep an eye on what is out there about you, so you know where things could come from, and you have kind of that, you've done what you could, I guess.
Well, I want to thank our panel for illuminating discussion on, obviously, it's a real corrosive problem getting worse. And I don't think we were exaggerating when we posed the question, is it a threat to democracy? Boy, it really seems to be. And I want to thank all of you for helping us at Massey to try to educate a wider public on how important this is. Thank you very much.